All right, so here's where we left off with the background in place. Now we're going to go to the tabletop. So I'm opting for the complementary pairing of kind of a red-orange and a little bit of a blue-green. So that blue-green will ultimately end up being kind of like a turquoise. So to first do that, we're going to address the cast shadows. So these are the shadows that are falling onto the ground. Remember, cast, you think of being cast onto the ground away from the object. So I'm starting off with those, and I have to keep in mind that the tabletop, the surface upon which those spheres are resting, is going to be blue-green. So that's going to influence my shadow color, and my shadow color will also have a blue-green influence on it. A cast shadow, and you're drawing it, you want it to start out darkest directly under the object, and then it will start to fade as it goes away from the object itself, as it falls across the tabletop. So I am using a photo reference when I'm doing this, and it helps me to visualize it a little bit. It's hard for me to like picture it in my head. I'm sure I can do it that way, but for me, I prefer to have either a visual reference of some sort, a photograph, or an actual setup in front of me, like the actual objects. You can do it either way. Like I'm indifferent, whatever method works for you. All right, so here in the background, or in the cast shadow, I'm starting to fade it out. I've got some blue-green on my brush. And you have to just realize that a couple of things, that the shadows in the distant ones, those persimmons that are off in the distance, those spheres, they're going to have a little bit lighter of a shadow ultimately than the one up front. The object that's up front is always a little bit more in focus. It's always a little bit brighter, more intense, and a little bit darker than the ones off in the distance. It's this rule of space and atmospherics that things kind of tend to pale out as they go back. All right, so now you can see that I'm starting to switch over to the foreground. This is a tabletop. A little bit of it goes into the middle ground, that's true. And I'm starting off with kind of this pale icy blue, but I'm gonna kind of adjust as I go. So if you want to adjust, you can either adjust off onto your palette, which is what I did, or you can mix a little bit wet into wet, but it has to be truly wet. So what I'm going to go for here is also an ombre. It's kind of one in reverse. It's going to be lightest at the horizon, and then it's going to get darker as it moves down towards the bottom of the page here. I also want to try and keep that line, that horizontal line between that kind of mint green color and the dark brown of the background. I want to keep that a little bit blurry. I don't want that to be a sharp line. I want it to be a hazy, out of focus line. So we've talked a little bit about edge control. It's going to be an extremely important topic when we're doing painting, that you want to be able to control that edge. And that can be a little bit tricky with acrylics, although there are multiple ways you can achieve it. So you have multiple choices. You can see I'm actually lightening this color a little bit. I'm adding some white to it. So I'm tinting it up. I'm adding some white to it so I get it a little bit lighter. And I think that's a good idea. If you have background and foreground, it's good to have them a little bit contrasty. So you have a contrast between the light of the foreground and the dark of the background. You could do it vice versa too. You just want some sort of contrast to separate the background from the foreground. So here I'm working on that edge that we were talking about. I'm going to be blurring it a little bit. It's hard to see what I'm doing there, but I'm kind of working wet into wet. This is a technique where you have both bodies of paint wet, so that means like the brown background is a little bit wet right there because I just re-wet it with my other brush, and so is the foreground, that minty yellowish light color. So I blended them together using that wet into wet, where I pushed the lighter shade into the darker shade a little bit, and then the other way around is true too. You can push the dark shade a little bit into the light, but you're basically going to get that fuzzy line. So I'm going to start to transition this down to a darker value. So there's that darker value. And I do want it to be a smooth transition because right now it's a little abrupt. And just like with the background, I'm getting multiple values there. It's not just one color. I'm trying to get multiples. And I'm mixing a little bit on the paper itself, the surface, and I'm also mixing on my palette too. If you were to look at my palette, I have a range of values there for the foreground. So here's where I'm darkening it down, getting a little bit more of that kind of turquoisey color, the blues, the yellows, blue and yellow and white mixed together. I'm also going to add a little bit of violet too, because I'm going to have it go even darker towards the corner. And again, just like with the background, you have to appreciate that this is going to be only the first layer of many. When you're talking about acrylics and oil paints, most people put on a series of layers. So like a minimum of 3 to 4. Next door, when they're doing advanced art, they're putting on even more layers than that. So that's how they get their paintings to look so rich and so solid, especially since we're working with acrylic, which has a tendency to, it can look really thin if you apply it with just like one thin layer. Now that being said, like I don't want you to go heavy on your paint right now. This is not where you spackle it on heavy. You want to still go thin and you're just pushing it around with your brush. You want to build it up very carefully and gracefully with thin coats of paint.